Hello and welcome to Absolutely Not. Thank y'all so much for being here. My name is Katrina Stroll. My pronouns are they, she, he, and you can learn more about me at my website, www.katrinastroll.com. Real quick, if you appreciate the work that I do here or elsewhere, please visit the Support the Mission page of my website. There are several options to choose from to support my work, so please choose one. The keywords for this episode are systemic, generational trauma, and marginalization. I encourage y'all to look up the definitions of these words and compare them to the definitions you carry with you on a daily basis. If you need help comparing, please let me know. This episode is sponsored by Headspace. Headspace has one mission: to improve the health and happiness of the world through meditation, sleep, stress, and mindfulness. Find out more about Headspace at the link in the show notes. Today's episode is titled, This Shit Runs Deep. And I'm excited to talk about it with our amazing special guest, Alan Thomas, he, they. Alan is a researcher with a background in psychology, education, and DEI. Growing up in Arkansas and graduating from Little Rock Central High School, he later got his PhD in counseling psychology and did research on topics including comics, media, race, and sexual orientation. After they were working in higher education as a faculty member and administrator, they took a leap to UX research after seeing the depth of marginalization in the higher education system. They identify as Black, queer, anxious, and neurodivergent. Alan, thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Ooh, and we already got into it about the title of this episode, This Shit Runs Deep. Why did you choose that title for today?
Honestly, there's so many thoughts, and part of the reason I appreciate being here is because I have a place to talk about them. This shit runs deep means that not only are we dealing with active marginalization that is occurring right now in multiple areas based on multiple identities, and of course, like changes and nuances and context, like it's dynamic, it's constantly moving. However, all that shit came from somewhere, right? All that shit came from our histories, our interactions with systems. One thing that comes to mind very readily is, Black folks in wealth, especially in America, that goes back to slavery. Why is that so hard to talk about? Why do we have to, like, quote unquote, prove that to people? The reality, or at least the reality that I live in, I'm not sure quite how to parse that. What I've come to, my realizations basically have been that a lot of this is a function of not just the systems and how they were set up, but again, our interactions with them, how they impact us, and then how we go on to impact other people as a result of our interactions with the system. So it's in my brain as like a galaxy or like a constellation, but constantly looking at how things are connected. And what I keep realizing is that unless we handle the root of things, then we don't necessarily handle marginalization, or we don't like create a sense of liberation or even justice for people. We only handle things that are right in front of us. However, the reality is that it's not just right in front of us, it's behind us, it's around us, it's below us. There are so many different factors that influence how we just even go about our day-to-day lives. And I needed a statement that summed all of that up. And so this shit runs deep is really where I came to.
And I love that you came to it. And I love that you came into the space with it. I have so many words written down from your description: active, dynamic, behind us, in front of us. There are a lot of people who are reading the story that's plainly in front of them. And they're not seeing it in context. Like, you're not seeing it in context as 1,000 years of the history of the United States. You're seeing it of like right now, this is what Black people are doing. And how many have you lately had to tell people, hey, I need you to see this in context?
Yes, because I feel like I'm always in that space. Part of that is, my prior work history, where I've come from. And it's not just one particular group of people. Like it comes up very often, most often with white folks. However, I have to have these conversations with everyone. Sometimes cishet Black folks, I need to discuss like the history of homophobia or transphobia with them. For folks who are able, discussing like what ableism is and how like something like the ADA doesn't actually meet needs. It sets a legal precedent, but that is a very, 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 very low bar. And so I find myself in this frustrated place a lot where I feel like I'm screaming out into the void or screaming from the rooftops like, hey y'all, it's not just this issue right now, it's all these other things. Or if you only take a, like, let's say a marginalizing event, if you only take it for just the XYZ or the who, what, when, where, how of what's going on, that's concrete and that can explain the situation, sure, but it doesn't always explain the history, doesn't always explain interactions with systems. It doesn't explain the nuances between not just like privileged and marginalized identities, but why our individual experiences matter and how we need to fold that in. So I guess I feel like I have this conversation a lot, or I'm doing it a lot, especially on social media. But luckily, I do have a good group of friends where they get it. I don't have to give caveats or qualifications. And so in some ways, I'm able to escape, the necessity of talking about that. But I wake up every day finding a new example of what I'm discussing, and it's endlessly infuriating.
Endlessly infuriating. And I hope whoever is listening to this understands that when you ask for these, like, I don't know, for a whole dissertation, just in a conversation about individual experiences, you're asking for like exhaustion, labor, you're asking for so much. And I love that you use the word individual, because one of the characteristics of white supremacy is like hyper individualism. Like, this affects no one but me, even if I'm causing harm. How are you extracting that from yourself and maybe the work that you do?
Honestly, it's a challenge, and it's something that I try to practice and work at all the time, because it is, our individual experiences matter, because in our day-to-day lives we're interacting with other individuals, other people, and while there's a lot of things we can do that directly tie back to overarching systems, especially systems of marginalization, it also matters how I say something to someone. What am I saying? How do they feel on that day? How do I feel? And so it's a both and an either or, but not at the same time, because to me it's recognizing that there's multiple factors at play. I kind of envision it like like I said earlier, like a constellation or maybe like a machine. I'm always considering like, how are these, or what are the moving parts, and then how are they moving together? So essentially it's like, we have to pay attention to the systems, and we have to understand how systems interact with us. And at the same time, those systems, while they're always active, they may not be directly active in our interactions. And so who I am as an individual, as like my solitary person and identity, that does have a role to play. And it comes out in those day-to-day, those everyday interactions, or that's one way that they can come out.
And I don't know, I'm trying to, like, I really appreciate the metaphor, the analogy of like the galaxy or the machine, or like all these cogs and everything's connected. And we need to figure out like, what constellation are we in, or like what solar system is near us, and like, how is that solar system going to turn into a black hole and eat us up? Like, we need to figure that out. But it also has me thinking of the term of like, what am I thinking of? Sorry, hypervigilance. Like, we're just extreme, especially because of the identities that we carry. Is there a different term that you use to describe like why you think so galaxy or solar system-y?
Part of that is me as an individual, me as a person. That's how I make sense of the world. And so I think that leans heavily into like neurodivergence, even though like I'm undiagnosed. It's just, if you send me a checklist about ADHD or being on the spectrum, I'm going to hit a bunch of those. So it helps me to think about things from a systemic viewpoint. However, I really appreciate you using the word hypervigilance because I try not to do that. Just a little bit of framing. My background is in counseling psychology, and so hypervigilance is something, and I might need to check this, and so I'm gonna put that in my back pocket. But it's been something that's commonly associated with symptomology, especially around trauma and PTSD. But it also is like it's really healthy, I guess, or it makes a lot of sense why it happens. So for me, I try not to be in hypervigilance mode because what that means is I'm paying a lot of attention to a lot of things. It's probably damaging my mental health, my sense of well-being. And there's a way for me to pay attention, but not be so tapped in that my sense of care is being overwhelmed, I guess. So I try to think of it like there are times where I do need to turn it on, like in these discussions, or if I teach again, those are the moments. Or considering like when I'm interacting with someone, especially if we consider like axes of identity, I do need to consider what are the privileges I have, what are the marginalizations, and then how does that interact with the other person based on what I know and also what I don't know. So it's definitely a process. But one of the things I really value from like counseling and psychology is how there's ways for humans to break that down and make it healthy for us that, uplift our well-being and that don't damage it, and that don't damage our relationships with other people. And it's not so much like a thing as kind of a practice. That's how I've been able to reframe it to make it much more helpful for me. So that way, like I said, I'm not constantly exposed to the pain of the world, because I mean, if you really wanted to be, you could, but that's a whole lot.
I cannot, like someone who is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, I cannot thank you enough for these words and for giving the permission in this space to say, I don't need, like, just because it's a diagnosis or something I am aware of doesn't mean I have to be tapped in all the time, is what you said. Like I'm able to practice whether or not, hey, I don't need to be tapped in right now. I don't need to be thinking cosmic right now. We are just in this space. We are mindful of where we're at. I love that. Where did you, well, you have a background in counseling, but like, where did you figure that out? How did you figure that out?
That's a really good question. So it's funny you put that in the framing of counseling, because there's a lot I learned from counseling. Like I know how to diagnose, I know how to develop treatment plans, run groups, so on and so forth. But there's so much that was missing from my education. And I primarily got it from social media, just really from sitting down and paying attention to other people's experiences and then thinking of my own. And again, like how do they interact and how do they come together? But I guess I try to consider like, what if the frame that I was taught on in terms of diagnosis and treatment was not a helpful one? What if it was more aligned with systems of power? And you can see that in a lot of places. And I have some unfortunate examples regarding that. And so I constantly try to, reframe or rethink things, or I guess evaluate, hey, is there another way to understand this? And sometimes I don't always have the answer right in front of me. However, maybe it behooves us to try, maybe it makes sense to say, well, yeah, hypervigilance is totally a thing. Let's talk about it in the therapeutic context, in the context of how people experience it, like in their everyday lives. But also like, what are some other ways it can show up? I also love words and language, and I love context and nuance and meaning. So it's all of this definitely feeds into like, galaxy brainness, but it also gives me the room to really to sit back and evaluate like how things are, and what is my role in all this. I know a lot of this is around stuff that's really painful and uncomfortable to talk about, and at the same time I've realized that like that's how I like to engage in the world, and I feel the most whole and healthy when I'm around people who give me the space to do that.
Oh, I hope somebody wrote that down and takes that with them forever. Whoever you feel the most whole and healthy around, when you're being your most true self, that's what you need to be. Like if Galaxy Brain is where you feel the most whole, and like that's the people you need to be around, is people who allow you to be, sorry, I keep saying Galaxy Brain, but like you allow you to be Galaxy Brain. I think about how you probably had peers who went through the same indoctrination, if you will, or the same education line who don't do that, who say, no, this is the textbook, this is the black and white. Have you been around people who will not stray from what they learned in education?
Yes, and honestly, that is what gives me the most pause, I guess. I have a lot of strong feelings about folks like that because I don't like rules. I don't want to go out and do harm by folks. Um, I just don't believe that the rules we grow up with or how we grow up with an understanding of rules is actually helpful. And in fact, like basically all of that ties back to patriarchy, classism, white supremacy, especially. And so we have to evaluate, where the rules come from. And one thing sticks out in my mind, like learning about ethics and counseling, it's all, don't touch the client, which makes sense. Don't have any kind of illicit relationships with them, which definitely makes sense. But I also noticed that like a lot of the cultural stuff around ethics was very much around basically non-emotive white men who shouldn't be touching folks, but I imagine many of them are. And it kind of changed when like I saw the president of the American Psychological Association. She had talked about, being a Latinx woman, having a client who was also from her community, and she gave her a hug. And another client was like, well, how come you don't give me a hug? And I was like, well, I can immediately understand the cultural context there. Because like the level of openness I was with queer or with Black clients or with folks who are, people of color or trans, whether my community or not, it was very different than cis clients or white clients, just because that cultural understanding and relationship was not the same. And I did not see that reflected in how we discussed ethics. So to go back to your question, because I also talk a lot, I do encounter folks like that a lot, unfortunately. And one of them came up this summer. So I'm on a Facebook group with a bunch of therapists from, my home state. And I don't know, I was just getting fed up because I would see people be like, well, what if some people are happy about, Roe versus Wade being struck down? It's like, that's not okay. That's super not okay. And then, I brought it to the group and they were like, well, how can you do that? Or how can you ethically nudge your clients? You're not supposed to tell them your politics. I'm like, I'm queer and I'm Black and I was doing counseling in the South. I'm sorry, but my politics are gonna come out. In fact, sometimes they need to show my clients that there's some propensity for safety with me. But there were a lot of people who pushed back on that. And they would say things like, well, we're trained to be neutral. And I'm always neutral. And it's like, that tells me immediately that you are not, because you're not evaluating where this stuff comes from. And you're not thinking about your potential impact on your clients. You're walking in like the expert. You're walking in with all these firm boundaries that really aren't based in humanity or connection. And then you're saying that you know how things are going. And the reality, like there's a wealth of research, there's a wealth of scholarship, and I'm sure like we've both seen like face to face in person when folks call themselves neutral, very often that like they're the exact opposite of it. And so it's that makes me happy to not practice right now, which is sad. It's a little bit bittersweet, though I'm not practicing for personal reasons too. Just that it taught me that what we learn, especially in training for counseling, is not actually how to challenge or even recognize systems of power. That stuff didn't start happening until really after I had graduated, though I did a lot of reading on it when I was in grad school because I wanted to do research with Black and queer people. So if people are only taking the rules and only taking the books and the textbooks, like they're missing an entire human context. Or let's just think about history. Like there's no queer people in history books, quote unquote, but like, yeah, they are, because if you're talking about two folks of the same gender living together for years, especially if there's only one bed, I'm sorry, they're queer. Or if you have instances of people using by those terms or from a historical perspective, going outside of the gender binary or dressing in gender nonconforming ways or having gender nonconforming expressions, they might likely be non-binary or trans, but non-binary or trans folks may not have had the opportunity to write history to really include them. And I don't know, that's why the title really matters. Like this shit runs deep, because we have to get people not just to understand the day-to-day stuff or something like counseling, not just diagnosis and treatment, but like, what are the changes that need to happen when you're working with someone from a different culture, which you always will. Or what are some of the cultural encapsulation that we see even as the rules are set up? And are we willing to challenge them and do something different?
And I am loving this conversation. The people in the audience are loving this conversation. I appreciate everything you are sharing in this space because it's needed to be said. One of the things I think of so often is when people say, oh, I'm neutral, and they say like, oh, I'm able to take on any client, every client, I'll be able to provide these services to any client. What are you saying about yourself? Like, how are you superior to other people that you're able to talk to anyone, that you're able to relate to everyone, that you're able to do this for? It's saying a lot by you saying, I'm able to do all of these things. You are unaware of what you bring to the table. You are unaware of your lenses. You are unaware of your identities. You are unaware of the systems that are in place, but you can chew in that as you'd like to. We're going to move on with the conversation. I love that you are being so honest about it here. One of the things I wrote down is empathy, because I think that's like a term that's been thrown around, but then it's very limited. Like once it gets to like race or something, like it's very strange. Have you seen that happen in any of the work that you're doing? Like empathy is just an umbrella term, but not being specific enough.
Yeah. The way I see empathy used a lot of the time is, just simply being able to take on someone's feelings. It's like, okay, so that makes sense. If someone else feels sad, then I can feel sad with them, or I can understand why they feel sad. But just like you pointed out, there becomes a limitation once that becomes couched in queerness or transness or being disabled or being from a community of color, especially for Black folks. There's, I'm trying to put it together, but there's like the general human way that we approach it that seems devoid of context and nuance. Like, sure, I should be able to empathize with anyone, but that goes against the reality that there are always limitations to that. Sometimes we just have bad days and our empathy meter is real small. Other times it's an experience that we've never encountered before. And so talking to someone from a different community that we may have never interacted with or sometimes never heard of, which is common in a global community, that suddenly it's not, it's not just empathy. It's like, well, I'm not sure what to do with this, or I'm not sure how to handle this. And just generally on the whole, this is where like stuff like indoctrination and history and systems come in, because we are not taught to understand why those differences matter or how they matter or how to be inclusive of them. It's, I don't know, it's, and may I use an expletive here? I guess, this shit runs deep is in the title. It's kind of a mind fuck, because it's like, I know that, like, I see you have different reactions to person A compared to person B based on, and the only like distinguishing factors are like the differences between those two people. And so, I don't know, we haven't talked about empathy in the context of anti-racism or queer gender affirmation. We haven't talked about it in a systemic context. Maybe that's the right word. So we don't always understand not just what empathy is, but why we might have limitations to it in the first place, and how those limitations are engineered in a lot of ways. I'll put it like that.
And I love that you keep using the word limitations, because for a lot of people, their belief is that if I am limited in the services I can provide or in what I can do for other people, then I may be causing harm. Bitch, you causing harm because you are unaware of your limitations and you think you can provide, like you're causing self-harm, you're causing harm externally. There's so much harm being caused. And I love that you're talking about all that harm in this space today. But so I really appreciate it. You talked about the decision that you made to pivot away from that work. Could you kind of talk about what led you to moving away?
So this is, you asked that question at a really particular time, and I appreciate it because for a long time, I had a lot of guilt about not doing counseling because, I had said I would do that for years, and I got my PhD, and then I stopped the licensure process. But there were a few things that were happening. For one, it took me a long time to own up, maybe, or internalize, I'll put it that way, internalize the fact that I took my licensure exam and I failed. And I didn't fail like badly because there's master's level and PhD level, and I was in between. And even offering that justification is me trying to protect my ego. So it's definitely a work in progress. But like I ended a 5-year relationship before I took the exam, and I know my mind was occupied. And then honestly, one of the major factors in me not continuing the licensure process and stopping clinical work was the fact that payments are always due at a certain date, right? So this one was due, I think, January 14th, and I couldn't afford it. And so I paid like a week or two later, and they're like, yeah, you got to start the process over because you didn't meet it at this point. And I was like, all right, that was a whole experience. And I keep thinking back, and I actually did try. Like I resubmitted the paperwork, I got references, I did everything. And I'm still not sure what the slip up was. Just they didn't have all my information. And so I was like, well, I can't practice. So what if I just stopped? But a lot of that too there was a lot of personal stuff that I was dealing with at the time that made that decision really hard. And I'm like I said, I'm still processing it, but I do feel safe to talk about that here today. And that's something I really appreciate. But really, it's a lot of it is heavily personal, but I can't only say it's personal because there were some systemic factors in that. And another thing is like, because of personal factors around licensure, but also, beyond it, I think about, 2020 after COVID hit, and I was in a better point emotionally by that time in my life, and doing counseling at that time, or if I had been doing clinical work over the past 2 years, I honestly would be very worried about my well-being right now. I know a lot of people who are still doing well and still okay. And honestly, most of the counselors I know are happy to do it. And that was my signal too, that like, maybe this work wasn't as fulfilling for me as I thought it would be, or I thought it was. So really, it was a lot of factors boiled in together. And also just the more I've grown and the more I've thought about it, just basically being away from counseling, I've also seen a lot of the issues or the limitations with it. And sometimes the company that I was in was not great. I'll be real and say, not every therapist should be a therapist. Many of them do a lot of harm. And like you've been pointing out, I think a lot of them are actually unaware of what's happening.
Dr. Thomas, is it? Good Lord. There's so much that you are bringing to space, and I am so so grateful that you are being so honest here, because there are a lot of people who are still processing all of the reasons why they could not continue in the field that they thought was fulfilling to them, and then realizing, oh, that was never for me to begin with. How did you get or was somebody supporting you through that time, or was it just you chugging along like, no, we need to be fulfilled?
I didn't get to the fulfillment point or the awareness of fulfillment point until very recently, like maybe within the past year. And a lot of dams had to break, honestly. But like, I guess it kind of comes down to, I needed some time to process what was happening. I needed some time to feel through what my experience was. And I needed to be real about, what was counseling doing for me? What was the benefit? What did it mean in terms of my career? And so, after I graduated, I was able to, keep up some clinical work toward licensure. However, my full-time job was in higher ed as an administrator and faculty member. And so, after I stopped doing clinical work, for one, it did free up a lot of time. So it's like, okay, this is going to be good because I already felt overwhelmed and overworked. And I thought about it more. I was like, I don't feel bad leaving counseling. And in fact, I don't want to go back. And I have had very few times where I wanted to go back, except for very recently where I was like, okay, I think the counseling field needs more people like me. I don't have to take on that responsibility though. I want to help people out, especially right now. I just know that counseling doesn't have to be the only way I do that. But really what we're talking about right now in the span of a few sentences or a few minutes is like 2, 3, 4 years of internal work that I needed to do to recognize, what was happening in my life and what did I need and how could things change. But also I started to realize, if I'm equipped to talk to people, to empathize with some cultural sensitivity, or at least the recognition that there are places where I need to work on it. And with the passion for helping people, counseling is not the only way to do that. And I had a lot of fun in education, but the education system is not great. That's a whole other conversation I could talk at length about. And I started to see that like there was a path that was open for me that I had never encountered before. And I also just realized that like in my natural state, I'm someone who likes to do a lot of diverse things, and I don't like to do the same thing all the time. And what if it's okay for me to be a career traveler or a career adventurer, for lack of a better term? I like to explore, and I like to do a lot of different stuff, and I'm equipped to do a lot of things, which not only am I grateful for in terms of the work and the support that I've had, but also like I recognize the level of privilege that comes with that. And I have the room to navigate and think about my career in a way that a lot of people don't. And so one of the other aspects of this, or of my career change, especially more recently, is wherever I go, I have to find some way to keep the door open. Part of that is pressure. Yeah, like I want to do good and I want to do right by people. However, it's also a recognition that like the world is not set up for folks like me to persist with happiness and with joy and with authenticity. What are the things that I can do to look back and keep doors open until doors don't have to be kept open anymore? How can I look out for other people and still do things for them? And so while I may not be doing counseling and I don't have intention to go back to higher ed anytime soon, I do appreciate what I learned and the people I interacted with, because they helped me see things more differently, and they gave me the tools to basically unpack stuff in the way that I ask other people to.
This is so fucking wholesome. Like that's like
I love it.
I don't want to cry, but this is just so wholesome. Like this makes me warm and in my whole chest. The permission that you're given. I wrote down a career adventurer. Do you know if somebody told me I could have been a career adventurer in elementary school, I would have picked that up immediately. I would have picked it up immediately. And I love the permission you are giving people, because although they may not identify the same as you do, they're going to see it. We talked about the check boxes that we could check on a list. If given the list, they will see it in you. And I hope that they see it. For the people that are listening to this and are thinking, you know what? I might start my adventure tomorrow. I might start career adventuring tomorrow. What would be the top 3 tips you would share with them about starting that new adventure?
So for one, you always have permission to, and you don't need my permission in the first place, but you always have permission to be a career adventurer, because there's so many things that you can be equipped for. Like I could go on a whole soapbox about like skills acquisition and what one thing allows you to do like 5 other things, you know? But you always have permission to. The second thing, and this one is the one that's the hardest to say, but I can never guarantee you that things are going to be rosy, that they're going to be smooth, that they're going to be like super awesome the entire time. But what I can say is what I've seen from other people, especially from marginalized communities, the more you do it, even recognizing the risks and recognizing the harmful systems that we live in, people often end up a lot happier. And that feels like a really light way to say it, but the reality is there's going to be some challenges with it. And some of those are going to correspond to our marginalized identities. However, if you feel like you can do it, and if you feel safe enough to do it, then I will always encourage that, because I do think it's worthwhile. I think it would be wrong of me to deny that there can be, or there will be, some challenging aspects of it. And then I guess the last thing from there is not practice a sense of gratitude. That feels a little shallow, for lack of a better term, but more like see if there's some joy that you can find in the process, or see how joy fits into your life among, navigating or adventuring through careers, or really any aspect of your life, because it can be there, and it can be there at odds with systems. And it can also be what helps to keep you afloat as you're navigating the process. So essentially, you have permission. There's going to be challenges, but also see if you can find a sense of joy there. Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
These are amazing recommendations. And we are in a time where people are prioritizing joy over salary, joy over titles, joy over a whole bunch of stuff. And I hope if you're listening to this, you jump on board. We'll take you with us on this next adventure. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much, Dr. Thomas. Are there
Yeah.
any last minute sprinkles that you'd like to share with the audience before we go?
Ooh, sure. You know what? Something that's been on my mind. Sometimes we live in worlds that keep telling us that we are not, that we can't be happy, that we should be okay struggling, or that we should be okay with things being challenging or even harmful to us. And some folks face that in different ways than other communities do. However, see if you can find ways to exist and maybe, dismiss the haters, so to speak, or dismiss, the negative criticism. But like, I don't know, my hope and my goal is to live in and to be and to help create a world where it doesn't matter who you are and it doesn't matter what you like and what you enjoy. As long as you are not harming people, you should be fine. So if you hear someone like, I love nerdy stuff, I have Pokemon plushies and stuff all over my apartment, and if I have a potential suitor who comes in and it's like, oh no, I was like, then you can leave. Because the person I'm looking for, or the people I want in my life, are the people who are going to see the things that make me joyful and either want to join in with me or will wholly support it. Find those people, find your breathe easy people that feel like just being around them feels as natural as bringing or breathing in the air that we all have to. Find those folks and be around them and live your life like they are always in your corner. Yeah, I don't know exactly where to end that, but just, y'all, there's a way for you to show up exactly as you are. No caveats, no qualifications. And there are people who are going to love you for just that. I hope, my fondest hope is that everyone is able to find that community and find the folks who can rally around them like that. And if there are difficulties there, I hope that any one of us or all of us can do things to mitigate the barriers that prohibit people from being able to find their community like that.
Okay, you ate that. I appreciate. I appreciate it. One of the things I wrote down is find your breathe easy people. I am all about my body. My body will tell me I'll turn red. My chest will tighten.
Yeah.
I'm finna use that for the rest of my life. Your qualifications. If I feel uneasy, if I cannot breathe around you, no more. No more.
That's
no,
it.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
My goodness, I have learned so much from this. I know everybody else will takes things from this space as well. Everyone, I found this amazing person on LinkedIn. Their information will be in the show notes. Please reach out to learn more about everything we talked about today. But until next time, keep saying absolutely not to everything unaligned and setting those boundaries. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Y'all take care.